In 1694, a Spanish missionary wrote 7 words in his journal that sealed the fate of an entire crop. It's too wild to control. That crop had fed civilizations for 5,000 years. It produced more protein than beef. It thrived in 118-degree heat. It grew with almost no water. Within 300 years, it was nearly extinct. Not because it failed, because it succeeded without asking permission. What if I told you that seed is still alive? That it's been sleeping in the desert, waiting for the moment when we'd finally need it? That moment is now. This is the story of the most powerful survival seed ever domesticated. And why it was erased just before we needed it most. The year is 500 BCE. The location is the Tehuacan Valley in Mexico. Archaeologists open ancient storage pits and find seeds perfectly preserved for 2,500 years. But the story goes back even further. In 2021, genetic analysis revealed something extraordinary. This seed was domesticated 5,000 years ago in a single brilliant moment in the Sonoran Desert. Think about that, 5,000 years ago. The people who first cultivated this plant had no written language, no advanced tools, no agricultural science. But they possessed a wisdom we've completely lost. In a harsh desert, where survival meant choosing what to plant first, they chose this bean before grain. Not for sentiment, for survival. This is the tepary bean. The scientific name is Phacelis acutifolius. It was engineered by evolution for one purpose: to live where nothing else could. Let me tell you what this plant can do. Its genome is a fortress. It produces special amino sugars that prevent its proteins from breaking down even when the air temperature reaches 118 degrees Fahrenheit. When the rains fail, its leaves fold up during the day to conserve water. They only open at night. It fixes nitrogen from the air, actually healing dead soil as it grows. And here's the big number. It produces more protein per ounce than beef. Up to 25 grams of protein per 100 grams of beans. It's comparable to meat. The Tohono O'odham people called it bawi. Simply, it is a bean. But their oral tradition tells a deeper story. They say the Milky Way isn't made of stars. It's made of white tepary beans scattered across the night sky. That's how abundant it was. That's how central to their existence. By 1,000 years ago, the Hohokam people were cultivating it throughout Arizona, using a method that defies modern agricultural logic. They planted them in arroyos, dry washes that flooded briefly during monsoon rains. They built brush diversion structures to catch the flash floods. The beans germinated with a single rain and matured in just 60 days. To monsoon rains, one full harvest. In regions where annual rainfall was just 3 inches, the tepary bean still produced food. By the 1920s, Tohono O'odham farmers were growing 1.5 million pounds of tepary beans per year. They traded them across the Southwest in a network linking Arizona, Sonora, and the Great Plains. The bean sustained entire communities through drought, through famine, through impossible heat. And it kept them healthy. Before processed foods arrived, the Tohono O'odham had virtually no incidence of type 2 diabetes. Their traditional diet of tepary beans, mesquite pods, and cholla buds maintained healthy cholesterol and balanced blood sugar naturally. The tepary bean was the key. Its soluble fiber slowed digestion. Its low glycemic index made it ideal for metabolic health. Modern research would later confirm something else extraordinary. Tepary beans contain protease inhibitors that inhibit the growth of certain cancer cells. This wasn't just food. It was preventative medicine growing freely in the sand. So how did a crop this powerful vanish from history? It wasn't nature that killed it. It was ideology. The first blow struck in the 1600s. Spanish Franciscan friars established dozens of missions along the Rio Grande. Their objective was threefold: convert the natives, pacify the land, and extract resources. The missions brought wheat, barley, and European cattle. Native farmers were told to plant wheat for church tithes. Tepary beans, wild, uncontrollable, requiring no European input, had no place in that system. That Jesuit journal entry from 1694 said it all. Too wild to control. That one line reveals everything. A plant that grew without irrigation, without ownership, without creating dependency, was a direct threat to the colonial order. Fields growing tepary beans were replaced or outright burned. The irony is tragic. Those European crops failed repeatedly during long droughts. The tepary could have kept everyone alive, but it represented the wrong kind of agriculture. Independent agriculture. The bean didn't die easily, though. Seeds stayed buried in the soil, sleeping through centuries, waiting for their moment to return. By the 1930s, a new form of erasure began. This time, the weapon wasn't fire or religion, it was mechanization. The 1920s had been a golden age for tepary cultivation, but World War II changed everything. Farmers left to work for wages on large-scale cotton farms driven by well irrigation. These new farms ran on machines, mechanical harvesters, tractors, industrial monoculture, everything designed for speed and uniformity. Tepary beans were labor-intensive. Their pods matured at different times and had to be picked by hand. If you waited too long, the pods would shatter, spilling beans onto the ground. A brilliant survival mechanism in the wild, but a nightmare for machine harvesting. In a system built for speed and uniformity, the tepary had no place. Government subsidies flowed to corn, soy, and cotton crops that fed livestock, not people. By the 1950s, the tepary bean was nearly extinct. A crop that had sustained 5,000 years of civilization disappeared in just 2 decades. But a handful of families refused to forget. Ramona Button of Ramona Farms discovered a few black tepary beans saved in an old trunk. Seeds that should have been lost forever were kept like heirlooms, tucked away in clay jars. Hidden in basements, passed down with whispered instructions. The bean was waiting for the world to need it again. That moment came in the 1970s. Global droughts hit hard. Soybeans dropped in yield. Corn struggled to pollinate under relentless heat. Even wheat, the colonial crop that had replaced the tepary, showed weakness under the 110-degree sun. Farmers in the American Southwest were desperate. Agricultural researchers began testing wild plants that still thrived in desert soil. What they found surprised everyone. A vine with small white blossoms growing strong at 115 degrees Fahrenheit. They tested it in plots near Tucson and Sonora. Even with almost no irrigation, it produced a full crop. The plant was the tepary bean. Alive and well after 4 centuries of attempted erasure. Scientists measured nitrogen levels in the soil after harvest. They were higher than before planting. The plant literally healed the dirt it grew in. A USDA researcher named Dr. Howard Scott called it a gift from the past to the future. They compared it directly to soybeans. The tepary delivered 20 to 25% protein, resisted pests naturally, and needed 1/3 the water. It wasn't a relic from a bygone era. It was a survivor perfectly designed for climate extremes. But survival alone doesn't guarantee a comeback in modern agriculture. The tepary had everything big agriculture claimed to want: high yield, drought resistance, natural soil recovery. But there was one fatal problem. It refused to belong to anyone. You couldn't patent it. You couldn't modify it genetically and claim ownership. You couldn't sell expensive fertilizer packages alongside it because it didn't need fertilizer. It healed soil on its own, and that made it completely invisible in a system built around corporate control. Agricultural journals labeled it unsuitable for commercial production even while research papers praised its climate resilience. In simpler terms, it wasn't profitable. And in modern agriculture, profit beats survival every single time. But a few people refused to accept that answer. Around 1996, a community group called Tohono O'odham Community Action began collecting ancient seed lines from elders and forgotten storage jars. Each variety had its own name, flavor, and story. Some hadn't been grown for over 300 years. Farmers like Terrell Dew Johnson worked by hand. No machines, no chemicals, just desert soil and memory. They called it planting the ancestors. By the early 2000s, they harvested enough to feed families and sell small bags to local schools. The beans appeared in traditional stews, tortillas, and bread. Elders said the flavor tasted like the desert itself. Kids who had grown up on store-bought food learned how to plant, soak, and cook the same beans their great-grandparents had carried through dry seasons. Every seed represented survival. The group eventually built a food coop and partnered with universities to share data. They proved that tepary could grow with 75% less water than modern beans, but the revival went beyond food security. It restored identity. Farmers said growing it felt like remembering who we were before the drought. As tepary crops began to spread again across the Southwest, scientists started paying serious attention. Today, climate models warn that over 30% of global crop yields could fall by 2050 because of rising heat. Yet the tepary bean has already lived through worse. It was born from heat. In fields where corn and soy wither and die, the tepary stays green, setting pods even at 115 degrees. Scientists now call it America's survival crop. In 2019, university trials in Arizona and Mexico confirmed what desert farmers always knew. Tepary beans used less than one-third the water of soybeans while producing nearly equal protein. That means they could feed families in regions where rainfall barely touches the soil. The International Center for Tropical Pleoa Agriculture in Colombia is now testing crossbreeds of tepary and common beans to transfer drought and heat resistance to global food systems. Governments have started testing it for food security programs, but the real momentum is coming from indigenous farmers. They see it as more than just a crop. It's a bridge between the past and the planet's uncertain future. As one elder told researchers, "We grow it because it remembers how to live when everything else forgets." The tepary bean story follows a pattern we've seen before. Amaranth was banned by conquistadors for being too sacred. Ancient grains were replaced by hybrid varieties that farmers had to buy every year. Perennial food systems were destroyed for annual crops that require constant inputs. Indigenous crops that enable food sovereignty are systematically erased. Not because they fail, because they succeed without creating dependency. The tepary represents everything the industrial food system cannot monetize. It grows without purchased inputs. It improves soil instead of depleting it. It survives climate extremes without genetic modification. It provides complete nutrition without supplements. Most dangerous of all, it allows communities to feed themselves without middlemen taking profit at every stage. That's why it was called too wild to control. That's why fields were burned. That's why it was labeled unsuitable for commercial production. Control was always the goal. Food sovereignty was always the threat. The story of the tepary bean isn't about rediscovery. It's about recognition. The knowledge was never lost. It was deliberately ignored. And now, while the world spends billions searching for drought-proof seeds, gene editing solutions, and climate-resistant varieties, the answer has been waiting in the desert for 5,000 years. The bean that clothed itself in scarcity. That thrived in armies of heat. That survived missions, mechanization, and corporate erasure. It never stopped offering its gifts. It simply waited for us to remember. This knowledge isn't lost. It's buried in every seed, every pod, every harvest. The crop we called backward may be the future of survival. Climate change is accelerating. Water is becoming scarce. Temperatures are rising beyond what modern crops were bred to handle. And in the desert, the tepary bean grows stronger. It doesn't ask for much, just recognition, just the chance to do what it's done for 5,000 years. Feed people when everything else fails. The question isn't whether the tepary bean works. The question is, are we ready to grow food that doesn't need to be bought every year? Are we ready for crops that heal soil instead of destroying it? Are we ready for a food system that works without corporate control? The tepary bean waits in the desert sand. It has waded through centuries of erasure. It survived because some families refused to forget, because some seeds stayed hidden in clay jars and old trunks. Now it's growing again. Not in industrial fields, but in community gardens. Not for profit, but for survival. Not because corporations approved it, but because the people who know the desert best never stopped believing in it. Next time you hear about the search for climate-resistant crops, remember this: the answer isn't in a laboratory. It's in the seeds our ancestors knew were worth saving. Resilience growing in the sand, waiting to feed us, waiting for us to remember. If this story changed how you think about food, security, and climate survival, share this video. Knowledge about resilient crops needs to spread before we desperately need them. Subscribe for more deep dives into forgotten foods that outperform modern agriculture. The next investigation is already underway. The future of food isn't in what we're engineering. It's in what we almost destroyed, and it's still alive, still waiting, still ready.